The next talk will be by Helen Bailey. Helen is a digital curation analyst at the MIT Libraries. Following a 2-year stint at the MIT as a library fellow for digital curation and preservation, she received her MSIS and CAS in conservation from the University of Texas at Austin in 2010. Her current position, Helen provides software development and data visualization support for the library's digital curation initiatives. Helen also chairs the electronic media group of the American Institute for Conservation, which I encourage you all to become a member of. And in her spare time, she dabbles in bookbinding and creative coding. Please welcome Helen for her talk, Disk Image and Then What? Sustainable Long-Term Storage and Access.
Thank you, Martha. Hi, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. As you might have gathered from the introduction Martha just gave, my background is not in museums or the art world. It's in libraries and archives. So I'm going to bring a library perspective to the process of preserving software-based art. Could we possibly switch this over to my slides? Thank you. So in any case, I'm going to talk about what happens sort of after you've done everything that everyone else here is talking about. What do you do over the next 10, 20, or 50 years to make sure that these artworks remain accessible? It's right after lunch, so I'm going to do my best to also try and keep you awake. We'll see how that goes. There we go. The keeping you awake part might be a little hard because my first topic's kind of dry. I'm going to talk about metadata, but when I say metadata, what I mostly mean is documentation. The exact kind of documentation we've all been talking about for the last 2 days. Fully half of the sessions in this TechFocus workshop have been about documentation of some sort. It's incredibly important to what we do. And by this, I'm talking about things like the components of an artwork, the significant properties of that work. I also want to say, Dragon mentioned yesterday that he's against the idea of collecting metadata just for the sake of having all this information. Did I paraphrase you correctly there? Great. I agree with this completely because I think that metadata is useful solely due to our ability to take action based on that information. So to use an example, also from yesterday's talks, 2 of the case studies presented were created and run in the Windows XP operating system. Great, that's easy to deal with. It's a recent, fairly modern OS. We all have access to it. Except Microsoft ended all support for Windows XP last year, which means XP has started its slow decline into eventual obsolescence. We're moving towards a state where virtualization and emulation will be absolutely necessary to access this artwork. That's fine. We know how to do that. But the question is, as you collect larger numbers of software-based art, how do you keep track of changes like this and stay on top of them for all the pieces in your collection? This is just the operating system. What about every other dependency that has to be tracked and managed? That's a challenge if you only have 10 software-based artworks. What if you have 200, like Rhizome, 2,000, or like libraries and archives, 200,000 objects that you have to manage? In addition, the numbers and complexity of software-based art are only going to increase over time. So this is where I contradict myself and say that metadata is not just documentation. In the library and archives world, when I say metadata, I mean something very specific. I mean pulling together information from a variety of sources, things like conservation documentation, technical metadata extracted from files, dependencies discovered through code analysis, and combining it into a single, standards-based format that is machine actionable and interoperable. And oh joy, there is already a solution out there for this. Preservation Metadata Implementation Strategies, or PREMIS for short, is a preservation metadata standard developed by the Library of Congress for documenting preservation information specifically about digital objects. It has elements for exactly the kind of things we've been talking about, including significant properties, hardware and software dependencies, object and environment characteristics, and the ability to log detailed actions performed on these objects. So here are some basic guidelines around metadata. 1, if you're not already documenting all this information, start there. Just do that. Make sure you have a thorough inventory and good documentation. But as you build your capacity to capture this documentation, converting it to, again, a standards-based, machine-actionable metadata format will allow you to automate dealing with risks. So here's an example of what I mean by that. I develop software that helps deal with digital preservation issues. Something I could do as a software developer is write a program that crawls technology websites for news about changes in the technology world, compare that to your metadata, and send you a notification if a dependency for one of your artworks is suddenly at risk. This is particularly important for software-based art because there are so many dependencies and they're changing constantly. That kind of ability is going to be incredibly essential as we move forward, but I can only build that tool for you if you're using standardized metadata. Before I continue, I want to mention just real quick that the guidelines I'm giving in this talk are not my personal opinions, although I do agree with most of them. They're based on the National Digital Stewardship Agenda levels of preservation. NDSA is a program, again, coming out of the Library of Congress, that is creating standards and guidelines for digital preservation efforts. I know this is hard to read. I don't expect you to read it all right now. But this chart offers guidelines for 4 levels of digital preservation actions that institutions should take, starting with what I'm calling the bare minimum guidelines at level 1, increasing to what is currently the best accepted practice in level 4. This chart is a really good way to identify both where you are in implementing digital preservation strategies and what your priorities should be to work on next. If you look at each of the rows in this chart and identify where your institution is, let's say you're at a level 3 on metadata, but you have not even reached level 1 on storage. That's probably where you should put your focus. And speaking of storage, that's what I'm going to talk about next. So out of curiosity, how many people here work at institutions that have a digital repository where you could put the files associated with your software-based art? Raise your hands. Okay, great. Some people do. I think that was roughly half the room. So I have good news and bad news. A repository is not some sort of magical digital vault that solves all your preservation problems. At best, a digital repository is software that can help automate good digital preservation practice. At worst, it gives people a false sense of security, and here's why. Any good repository can be configured to implement digital preservation strategies, but many are not. I've seen this firsthand. The reason is that it takes a lot of time and effort to set them up correctly, and it's up to each individual organization to make sure its repository, its particular instance of repository software, meets all the requirements of good preservation practice. Frankly, most organizations haven't done as thorough a job of that as we should. So everything I'm about to say applies whether you have a digital repository or not. Now let's talk about what I mean when I say stuff's gotta go somewhere. I mean, as has been said previously, all digital objects are in fact physical. The bits have to live on a physical medium. This is actually a fact of digital preservation that I think conservators may understand better than anyone else in the field, because conservators have to deal with those physical artifacts of the digital world every day. And the other fact you're all well aware of is those physical storage media are fallible. Ben mentioned this earlier, but I just want to reiterate that every single storage medium you could possibly put digital objects on will fail full stop. It's okay. Media failure is a problem we can handle. Unfortunately, many of us have developed some bad habits around how we handle storage media. If you've done any of these things listed in the past, I won't make you raise your hands for this one, but I will say they're not good strategies. So what are some better options? For starters, I just want to talk a little bit about what kind of media you want to store it on. This is a grid of the most common storage media you might use. You might be surprised to see optical media on there, but many people are still using optical media as a backup option, so it's there. The things I want to highlight are that the grid increases in long-term sustainability from top to bottom. You'll also notice that it increases in cost from top to bottom. Better storage is generally more expensive. There's also a trade-off for accessibility. If you want something to be immediately accessible on a server, it's going to be more expensive than, say, tape backups that will take a while to recover. There's also a technical implementation cost for each of these. External hard drives are easy to use. Cloud storage requires someone, not necessarily you, to have a lot of technical expertise, and so you're going to pay for that. There's also a lot of variability in quality within each of these options, so that's something you absolutely have to consider when selecting storage media. So let's assume you have the physical storage medium all worked out. You're going to store some digital artwork on your institution's server. That's great, only that's not enough. You absolutely have to have, at minimum, a second copy of the complete artwork and all its documentation stored in another geographic location, and you cannot assume that's already in place. I hate to call out my institution, but we had an unpleasant surprise a few years ago when we inquired about the actual physical storage location of our server's off-site backup and learned that off-site meant 2 miles down the road. If the Charles River floods, that's not going to be good enough. This is a benefit of electronic media. You can make copies, and you should, because in addition to hard drive failures and bit rot, there are natural and man-made disasters we have to be prepared for. The best practice is to have at least 3 copies in different locations and on different storage media types. That last part is essential because it helps mitigate the possibility that multiple storage media will fail at the same time. I also want to clarify a couple things about backup. It's a term I've heard a lot over the past couple days, but it means different things to different people. So backup in IT terms often, not always, means replication. If your IT department is providing backup for your computers or your servers, they may not just be copying the content to a disk and storing it somewhere. They're typically taking snapshots of the entire system on a regular basis, and there's a retention period for those snapshots. It could be 24 hours, it could be a month, it could be 3 years, but when it reaches that point, everything prior to that date gets deleted, which means that if a file gets corrupted and that corruption isn't noticed, all the backups from that point on are also corrupted. That's not what we want. So it's important to confirm that you have at least 1 copy somewhere that's not being replicated and that doesn't get replaced until you've had a chance to check the content and make sure it hasn't changed. And then about replacement. Any of those previously mentioned media will need to be replaced roughly every 5 years. With server and cloud-based options, hardware replacement is managed elsewhere, and it's built into the cost of buying storage space. With local options, you'll have to take care of that yourself. And that brings me to what I think is one of the most important and frequently ignored aspects of preserving digital objects: ongoing management. Joanna mentioned yesterday morning that digital objects aren't like paintings or other physical items that you can put in good storage conditions and leave alone for a while. If digital objects are ignored, they break. Files can get corrupted or deleted. Software, hardware, and file formats all become obsolete. I like to say that your digital objects are under constant threat of destruction. So it's essential to perform regular actions to ensure that your software-based artwork still functions. This, to my mind, is the linchpin of preserving all digital objects. You can document things to your heart's content, but the only way to ensure they'll be usable down the road is to perform active, ongoing management tasks for as long as you intend to keep the peace. These tasks include creating good metadata in the first place, checking file fixity, securing your content, and working to prevent obsolescence. So we talked about metadata already. File fixity means ensuring that a given file is fixed or hasn't changed from a previously known state. This is observed by using checksums, which Ben mentioned in his practical session. So when you create a checksum for a file and then alter the file, if you create a new checksum for that file, it will not match the original. I want to mention that we typically use the term checksum in digital preservation, but we're usually referring to cryptographic hash algorithms, which are a special type of checksum developed by cryptographers for information security purposes. Ben mentioned MD5 and SHA earlier. These are the two most common types of hash functions used by digital preservation tools. He also mentioned that MD5 has been reverse engineered. SHA-0 is actually also no longer considered a valid hash function for information security. SHA-1 has been demonstrated breakable. SHA-2 is available. SHA-3 was just released in August. But digital preservation tools tend to be a little behind the information security field. And honestly, our needs aren't quite as strict as those of, say, a bank holding trillions of dollars in financial account information. For practical purposes, a lot of the tools out there use MD5, and for many use cases, that's probably okay. So the other thing about checksums is they're great, but they're really only useful when they're verified to ensure that the files they represent haven't been altered. So while it's absolutely essential to create checksums on the ingest of digital artworks, the best practice is to verify them regularly, and especially when performing tasks where loss of data is likely, such as transferring files from one storage medium to another. Again, this is a good argument for having multiple copies, because if you attempt to verify fixity and discover that a file has been altered, you should be able to replace it from another copy. I should mention briefly that there are many tools out there for creating and verifying checksums. Bagot, the Bagot library and tools around Bagot is a really good one that's often used for digital preservation purposes. So information security is a huge field within IT, and none of us are going to become experts in it because we're experts in other things. But there are some elements that we should concern ourselves with, primarily around access and auditing. There was some mention yesterday of issues around hacking into artworks in museums and galleries, and that's the kind of thing we have to let our IT departments be the experts in because that's their job. But you would be surprised at many institutions how many people have the ability to edit or delete digital collection materials. Whether those actions happen, whether they're malicious or inadvertent, they are real potential threats. So this is fairly straightforward, but at a minimum, you should have documentation of who has write and delete access to all collection files, who has the authority to change those permissions, and if you can, require multiple people's authorization to perform delete actions. That's actually one of several areas where digital repository software can be really helpful because that may be a built-in function. It's probably a function that has to be turned on, but it may be there. You also want to maintain and review logs of all actions performed on files. And here I want to expand on something Ben said earlier, which is that checksums help you determine the authenticity of a file. That's true. Checksums can help you determine that a file hasn't changed. But checksums combined with access logs are actually what prove authenticity, to demonstrate that someone hasn't gone in and altered both the file and the metadata with the checksum, which is possible. Again, it's possible that your IT department is maintaining these sorts of logs, but you want to clarify what's being logged, confirm what the retention period is for those logs, who has access to them, and if possible, consolidate that information into the rest of your preservation metadata, which you can do with Premise. And finally, regarding obsolescence, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but the best way to mitigate obsolescence is to both have good metadata and to review it regularly, whether you're doing that manually or using automated tools. You want to migrate code, test emulation for problems, and deal with other risks of obsolescence as they arise. The more frequently you interact with your software-based artworks, again, whether that's manual or using automated tools, the more likely those works are to remain accessible for the long term. So that's everything I have prepared. I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
So what would automated checking of an artwork?
Can you state your name when you come up, just so we get to know?
Sure, J.P. Brown, Field Museum. What would automated checking of an artwork look like?
So the biggest thing I would say is probably actually the example I mentioned. Do you mean looking at the artwork itself or the metadata?
Sorry, you talked about checking integrity, or at least checking the functioning either manually, by starting the artwork up and looking at it.
Right.
Or you raised the possibility of doing it automatically. So what would
Yeah,
that look
so
like?
To my knowledge, tools to do this don't exist yet, but this is why I have the job I do. So I can envision tools that would, in fact, start up those programs, right? Make sure they can function. If you're a software developer, you can build tests that test whether the program works, right?
Yeah, you can, but you can't test output a lot of the time.
That's true. But if you can build in a few tests, even just a couple of tests for each artwork, that would give you some indication, right, without having to go in and check it manually.
Yeah, you're right. So what kind of tests do you think would be important?
Well, so if we're talking about the program itself and not the metadata, I mean, I think checking the dependencies actually is one of the biggest issues, which you could do within the code itself if you wanted to run tests on the code, or my personal preference would be within the metadata. So the example I gave of looking at technology, right, doing an automated sort of scrape of the web for technology news to see what sort of dependencies are becoming high risk, and then sending alerts to you. The very simplest one I would say is just write test scripts that run the program. Does it run? Does it start? Will it open?
But how can you tell? I mean, thinking about the artworks that we've looked at in the last 3 days, right? What sort of script could you write that would actually boot it up and you could ensure functionality?
I don't think you could ensure full functionality, certainly not. Well, maybe you could if you wanted to build an entire suite of tests, right? But you could write a couple of tests that would check whether it starts. So if it runs in a web browser, right, there are test suites for web browsers where you can run an application and see if it functions in the web browser, if it opens, not necessarily if it's doing everything you want it to do. But that would at least give you an indication, right? If it's not opening at all, you have a problem.
We have time. We'll do a question quickly. Let's see if we can get through it. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm Tarkan Esmashid from Rhizome. I think that it is very interesting that the library field is putting so much input into the field of digital preservation, and the art field is in many cases really lagging behind. But I think there's also really required a reflection on what are what are the important things for library and what are for an art institution. For example, the levels of preservation are very much focused on the vault, on storage, and the last square at the right bottom is the most important square for us. And are there any other, I mean, this is something that the library would do like as the deluxe version of whatever, but are there any other things that you might see as very different, or where there would be more conversation required?
Certainly, I think the issue of scale is the biggest one, and I think that was very clear from your talk yesterday. The library and archives world doesn't have the luxury, as was mentioned yesterday, of looking at every individual item, which is part of why we think about these things like building in tests and automating sort of the analysis of metadata and dependencies and risk, because there's no way we can look at 200,000 items even once every 5 years and make sure that that object opens, much less displays what we want it to display. So that I would say is probably the biggest difference, in my opinion.
Just a quick question. Is this PowerPoint and other PowerPoints from yesterday and later on today could be available to us?
I believe so.
We're going to talk about that internally. The videos will definitely be online very soon. And we have to talk internally about it.
Okay, thank you.
So I can just say really quickly that it's possible there might be some rights issues with putting some of them online.
Delete those slides and put the rest up.
I do, personally, I put all of my slides from any presentation I do on SlideShare. So this PowerPoint will be available, I can say that for sure. Thank you.